Good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Stutz, Director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning for another of our virtual genealogy programs. Today's topic is School Days, which will focus on researching school records and will be presented by our esteemed volunteer and Friends Board member, Terri Meeks. Before I turn it over to Terri, however, I have a few things to mention. If you have any questions or comments that you want to ask or share, please post them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and Terri will answer them at the end of her presentation. If you would like to test your chat box function now, you may do so by simply typing hello and clicking enter. One other announcement. The Friends of the Museum will be hosting an old-timey movie night this coming Thursday and Friday at the museum starting at 6:30 p.m. with a suggested donation of $4. There will be a different movie shown each night, so please join us if you can. Also, Saturday, October 9th at 9 a.m., Terri will be presenting another virtual genealogy program all about creative ways to share your genealogy research just in time for the holiday season. We will be posting the online registration for this program in the days ahead, so please look out for that. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. In case you're having any problems, you can email to the following address, and we'll hopefully get you started appropriately. We think about schools and education pretty much as a 20th century tool, but know that since the founding of the country virtually, education has been an important part of the life of both the colonists all the way up to present day. And here are just some of the major milestones in education, starting in 1635, where both Massachusetts and Virginia offered schooling for, at this point, men only. Harvard College was founded in 1636. And we see as we go along that by the 1700s, 150 years later, we get women's education started. We also see by 1817, we get the first school for the deaf. And it was shortly after that that the first school for the blind was also instituted. Many of us have heard of the McGuffey Reader, and they date from early times as well. And the first college for women was opened the same year as the first co-educational school. So we notice that most of these are in the eastern states, which of course were settled at that particular time. The West was still brand new. And it wasn't until 1852 that we get the first mandatory attendance law. And that was not enforced in all of the states. And just because it was mandatory attendance didn't mean that it was for a lengthy period of time. And we'll discuss some of the reasons for that, or for a complete 12-year program of education. Kindergarten was started in 1856 and followed by junior college, the first public community college and junior colleges. And it was in 1909 that a junior high school was started, and Maria Montessori, her program was introduced into the United States as late as 1911. And finally in the 1920s, we got compulsory public education. And many of the dates that we're going to see today will be dating from the 1920s. For the most part, schooling started out in one-room schoolhouses or even in private homes. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the one-room schoolhouse was the norm of the day. There was a single teacher who taught from grades 1 through 8, and in most cases, that teacher was a woman, not a man. Boys and girls were sometimes separated. They even had separate entrances into the schools. And girls might have a different program of education. They might be steered more towards the domestic capabilities, home economics, etc. The youngest children usually, or the ones that were just entering school to learn their ABCs, were called abecedarians, and they were seated up front of the class to make it easier to learn. Older children were used to teach younger children. You can imagine having 8 different grades in a single classroom. The teacher had to concentrate on one particular group at a time. So the older children would help the younger or the weaker children. Schools were racially segregated all the way up until 1954, and even then, complete integration was not in force. Schoolhouses, whether they were one room or multiple room, usually served children that were living within a 4 to 5 mile radius. And it was up to the students to provide their own transportation, whether they walked, rode a horse, or rode in a wagon, or later in a car. It was expected that most children could get to a school within a 4 to 5 mile radius. They would bring their lunch in a tin pail, and it wasn't until the 1920s that hot food like soup became available within the school, thus starting the school lunch program. Attendance varied, very few days by comparison with today, and absenteeism was very high in those farming communities, whether it was planting or harvesting. The average attendance for farm students was really only about 106 days per year. Classes usually started around 9 a.m. and wrapped up anywhere between 2 in the afternoon and 4 in the afternoon. High school attendance was extremely low well into the 20th century. If you've looked at the 1940 census and looked at the column for education, you will note that the vast majority of people did not complete 4 years of high school. Many of them only had 1 or 2 years of education. Some, the uniform was pretty much 8 years of education. So thinking about schoolhouses and activities, in 1917, kickball was introduced at recess, and games like jacks, Red Rover, and hopscotch followed in about 1919. There was 1 hour for recess and lunch, and it was called nooning. And as we have said, we by the 1920s, we were getting some warm school lunches. What kinds of lessons did they learn? There were the typical subjects of reading, writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's, history and geography, and deportment was very important at the time. You know, how a person carried themselves, their morals, their, I'm at a loss for words, but there were other things. Citizenship was very, very important, as well as the subjects that were actually taught in the schools. Memorization and recitation were key tools in learning. Memorization was used to get the facts across, and recitation was used for the teacher's benefit. The teacher could completely understand how much the student was learning and retaining, but recitation also allowed her to correct any mispronunciation of words among the students. So here again, girls got a different education in many cases than their male counterparts. Corporal punishment was used widely. Discipline was strict. Students might have gotten hit by a ruler over the knuckles. In my own personal experience, I had a music class in 3rd grade, and we learned to play the piano, and the teacher would hold the ruler under our wrists to keep our hands up in a proper position. And if you made a mistake, that ruler came out and whacked you across the knuckles. So I have personal experience in that area. A student might be forced to go to the board to write a phrase or a sentence numerous times over and over again. I shall not talk in class, for example. And of course, there was the Dunce Cap. And the Dunce Cap has an interesting beginning. It started in Scotland with a man that had a name very similar to pronunciation to Dunce. And the student was sat in the corner with the Dunce Cap on. And it was believed early on at the time that knowledge would come through the cone into the head of the student. So while sitting in the corner, perhaps rather than a punishment, they were getting further instruction. Some of the Dunce Caps also had bells on them, so that if the student sitting in the corner moved at all, it drew attention to him or her, further humiliating the person. So an interesting history there in the Dunce Cap. For most, up until the 1940s and 50s, education did stop in the 8th grade. So it's interesting in terms of classes, music was frequently taught, but it was music theory. It might have been voice, and in rare cases, it was an instrument. And normal colleges or normal schools, which were set up for the training of teachers, made sure to emphasize music in their curriculum because they knew that it was important to teach in the schools. Gym classes were originally called physical culture, and they were adopted from the German and Swedish gymnastics programs. And it wasn't until the 20th century that health and hygiene became part of the gym instruction. So, and teachers, they might board with a student's family. Depending on how far you lived away from the school, in many cases, there was more than that 4 to 5 mile range for people to get to school. And students themselves from farms might, especially in the wintertime, move into town and board with a family. And the teachers also were sometimes involved in that type of system as well. It was interesting to note that by 1900, mill workers, a vast majority of mill workers lived in mill villages and factory villages. They were provided with housing, and of course there was the company store that we've heard about. But some of these mills and factories also sponsored schools, and they might have provided the building as well as paying the teachers' salaries. However, the owners, they had little to gain by having the children go to school. So if they needed something in their mill or factory, they needed something to meet a deadline or a timely production, they would pull students out of the classroom to fulfill their needs. After all, money was king. Conditions in all of the school systems, whether they were mills, factories, or the one-room schoolhouses, by the 1910 teens, when school became mandatory for those under the age of 12, conditions were improving. So where do we start looking for school records? I can advise you right at the very, very start. Very, very few of these records are on the internet. So this is going to involve legwork, visiting communities, but we're going to start at home. And the first place usually that we look are yearbooks. Whether an high school, an advanced education yearbook, and even in some cases, elementary schools produced yearbooks. So you might be able to find information there to add to your your ancestors' story. It was really interesting in preparing this presentation that I looked through some of my own yearbooks, memorabilia from my school days. And it's important to perhaps write a chapter in your genealogy to let your children and grandchildren know what you did in terms of schoolwork. School is very, very different nowadays than it was when I was growing up. And I assume that some of those changes are valid in your experience as well. So it might behoove you to go through, look at some of the pictures and get that story written down to share with your descendants. When looking at yearbooks, we easily find either a senior picture or a grade level picture, but look at other things as well. What clubs and organizations did you or your ancestor participate in? Were there sports programs in the school? And if so, what sports? Depending on the area of the country, sports were different. You did not see snow skiing in Georgia schools. So think about what sports were there, whether you participated them in or not. But in general, what kinds of clubs, activities, and sports were available in that particular school? Who are some of the friends and acquaintances that might have signed the yearbook? Are they lifelong friends? Were they just casual acquaintances as you went through school? Was there a particular incident that happened that involved one of these people that by looking at those signatures, you recall a particular party, an incident, or some, did they win some special award that you might be associated with as well? Who were the advertisers? Usually in the back of a yearbook, people that sponsored the printing of the yearbook might have put greetings in. And if your family was one of those advertisers, you might want to consider that as well. And we'll look at some of the things that do appear in yearbooks that might involve not only you, but others in your family or ancestors. Report cards. They usually, of course, give us our names, as well as the parent and guardian signatures. You get the teachers' names, and you find out how well or how poorly the student has done. This happens to be a senior picture, and it happens to be of my mother, and it is her college graduation. So rather than in high school where people were looking forward and it would talk about the clubs and organizations that they might have belonged to, as well as what their hopes were for the future. Were they going into the job market? Were they going on to a technical school? Were they going on to college or university or entering the military? But in this particular case, the senior yearbook gives more information about the type of person that she was. So try and see if you can't find yearbooks to see what people were doing and to get maybe some of those personal influences and how other people saw your person. Clubs and organizations, were they large? Were they small? What was the role of the club in the school and in the community? Things have changed nowadays, and youth are more involved in town or civic responsibilities than they were in the days that I went to school. So look and see what the responsibility of that club is, to see what types of information and what types of commitments they made to growing either the school or the community. Sports, who participated in the sports? Were they good at that particular sport? Or were they among a losing team in that particular time frame? Even the commitment of young people to a losing effort is a significant accomplishment. Who signed the yearbook? Who are those friends and who are those acquaintances that might have influenced you or your ancestor, and what types, here again, of activities were involved and who was involved in them? We mentioned the advertisers. Were your people among the community members that contributed to the publication of a yearbook? And it also brings up, do you remember the stores or these places in the community? And does it key any memories for you or about your ancestor. Who were the teachers in the school? This happens to be from here, right in Canyon City. And the photo, the information is contained here at the Royal Gorge History Museum. And it gives the Canyon City School faculty. And I believe this is in about the early 1900s. And fortunately, each one of these teachers is named and numbered so that they can be recognized. So, was one of your parents, were you a teacher? Do you have photos of yourself with your class? Or was one of your parents or a grandparent a teacher, or any relative that might give you clues? We talked about the lunchroom people. Starting in the 1920s, hot lunches might be available. So here is a photo included in the yearbook of the lunchroom staff. And was one of your people a supporter of the school in this particular area? Report cards. Report cards are always wonderful to look at. You know, did your mother or your grandmother make an A in home economics? Or did they make a C? Did someone take wood shop and excel, or perhaps not do so well? One of the interesting things that I see in this particular report card is this is for a sixth grader. And I believe that these are swapped back and backwards. But how tall was the person and how much did they weigh? So you get an idea of body conformation at this at the age of approximately 11 years of age. So she's under 5 feet tall at this particular point in time. So little clues like that, as well as the grades and the subjects that they were taking. The number of days in each of the 6 weeks is also an interesting, or the days present, to see, you know, how much absenteeism was there. This happens to be a report card from one of my neighbors who has since passed away. And it was his kindergarten year in Dallas, Texas. And we get the signature of, this happens to be his father, E. Ray. He was named after his father, the school that he attended, who the teacher was, who the principal was. And because it's kindergarten, he's getting handwork, he's doing above average, but in music, he's doing average work. And I believe the P means that he was below average, but he brought it up. So there is more information to be found in newspaper articles, as well as those yearbooks. What are the events that were occurring? Did your person make the honor roll? Were their names listed in graduation lists? Here again, the club activities. Those were reported in newspapers. And of course, the sports teams and the sports events were also, did they go to state meets? Did they go on to become national champions? And school reunions, those are important announcements to look for, and who attended those reunions. not only in the yearbooks, but there were school pictures taken. So are there classroom pictures that you might have of either yourself or an ancestor that you can identify them in? And programs, were there presentations, school plays, music programs? Usually there were, at the end of each of the semesters, there might be some sort of public program to introduce the students and for them to demonstrate their abilities and what they had accomplished during that semester. Here's a newspaper article that happens to list they've organized a club of girl reserves of the YWCA. And the officers, this is my mother, she was elected president. I have no idea what this particular type of club did, or the girls reserves did. So more information for me to root out. Here is an honor roll, and it's from 1886. Sometimes you have to dig for this information. We may have newspaper articles where we might have made the honor roll, or we might be listed in something. But don't forget to try and look further back to find one of your ancestors in one of these particular situations. And what's interesting in 1886 is they have to achieve 95 or above, but including recitations that we talked about earlier, examinations, and deportment, those three critical things. And they list those people that have achieved that, go on for a silver honor roll below, etc. Graduations. Is there a listing of graduates for a particular school? This is where it's very, very fortunate if you live in a small community. Those names are going to be listed, all of the graduates. And as you go back further in time, there are fewer and fewer graduates. So you might be able to find that short listing. If you went to a high school, or your people went to a high school, say, for example, in Boston or New York City, you're probably not going to find this information because they didn't take up the space to produce or print 500 names. What were the club activities and what were they doing with respect to the community? And who were the officers in the community? What types of activities were they undertaking to represent the school within the community? So newspapers are an extremely valuable resource. Team activities. Did you or your ancestor participate in a winning season? Or was there a particular game that someone did an outstanding performance? And it doesn't have to necessarily be you or your ancestor, but an associated team member, and gives you an idea of the feeling of the team and the esteem that they might have held that person in. Reunions are a great source of information as well. Did the newspaper announce a school reunion? In this particular case, yes, the school, and it's not in the year 19,808. It was from 1908 when the first class of only 10 children graduated up to 72. They're going to hold a multiple year reunion. So who are some of the people that are sponsoring it? Who are the people that are going to attend? And there probably is a follow-on article from the newspaper about this particular reunion. School pictures, whether it's that one-room schoolhouse or whether it's a multiple large education building. Do you have a picture of the teacher and her students? This happens to be my mother with the black bow in her hair. So it was probably taken about 1915. It's interesting. I also happen to know that this little boy who's picking his nose went on to become a doctor and the mayor of their hometown. This also is a picture, and this young lady here was my grandmother. And this is probably in her senior year. So she's probably about 18 years old. And this probably dates from 1895, 1896. We mentioned some of those school programs. Here's a performance by the Glee Club and Orchestra, and this is from 1926. Here again, this is from my mother's high school. And there's always more stuff. This is all this, and we're still in your home. Hopefully you can find some of these things. Do you have your diploma or diplomas from some of your ancestors? Graduation programs. Did you have a scrapbook when you were in school? Did you get a high school ring or a pin? And do you still have it? Were there letter jackets or uniforms that might have been saved from previous generations? I have found some old textbooks in my own family home that will give you an idea of what types of literature and what types of study people engaged in. Autograph books. These were very popular probably in the 50s, 60s, and maybe as late as the 70s. But do you have an autograph book with the signatures of friends and greetings? And many schools publish alumni directories. I know my husband has one for his high school, and I have seen a number of alumni directories and actually have discovered that some ancestors attended some specific schools that I didn't know anything about. So check out those alumni directories in the local community where your ancestor lived. Here is a nursing school diploma for my mother. A high school graduation program, and that high school still exists to this day. A scrapbook that you might have kept or an ancestor might have kept. High school rings. This happens to be my high school ring. This happens to be my grandmother's graduation pin from Egbert's High School, EHS, in 1896. This is a letter jacket for my husband's Uncle Tommy, who was on the football team of Lamont High School in Lamont, Oklahoma. And apparently he played on the football team for 3 years. Or lettered for 3 years. Unfortunately, the jacket or sweater no longer exists, but we do have the letter. Old textbooks. If you went to school in the 50s or early 60s, or even prior to that, you might have learned some of your first grade reading might have been with Fun with Dick and Jane and their dog Spot. An autograph book. This is one from 1883, and it's to the friend Jake from Willie Smith. May all your days be days of prose, slide along as slick as grease. I'm not sure that we would write that kind of greeting nowadays, but it gives you an idea of the of time and place. We'll leave it at that. Alumni directories. I have seen very many of these that are in bound volumes, and they may cover a single year or they may cover many years. This happens to be an extract from an alumni directory that is, there's a document that says where the book was. It was composed by a doctor in 1944, but it is a listing of those who graduated in 1896 and 1897. And my grandmother's name does appear with her classmates. So it gives me an idea of who she attended school with, and perhaps find some further information to add to her story, and perhaps be able to identify who the other people are in that photo that we saw earlier. If you know the school where your ancestor attended, do you have a picture of that school? Do you know the history of that school? What subjects were taught and who were the teachers? For most of us, we know that information about ourselves, especially high schools and grammar schools. For our ancestors, we might know the information about the high school that they might have attended, but we frequently overlook the elementary school years, and we don't know what school they attended. And we'll look at some of that as well. My grandmother attended Egbert's High School, and this is a picture of the school. This picture was found in 1907, and I actually found this in the Cohoes Public Library in one of their research files. So try and see if you can't find some of this information about your parents or grandparents. Did you attend the same school that your parent or grandparent might have attended? So there might be multiple generations in the same school, which adds more drama to the presentation. We mentioned one-room schoolhouses back in the day, and this one happens to be from Red Rock, Oklahoma, and we will see some other records that are available for this particular school. So there are records for one-room schoolhouses, and they went well into the 20th century. So don't overlook one-room schoolhouses. This is a picture from 1935 of a one-room schoolhouse, and we notice a heating unit to keep them warm. We notice that the students do not have individual desks. We do see that there is a back shelf for them to have their books put upon, and bench seating. We see also that the girls and the boys are integrated with one another in this particular setting. The history of the school. We just looked at a photo of Egbert's High School or Egbert's Institute, and this was donated by Mr. Egbert Egberts, wonderful name, in 1864 to the community of Cohoes, New York. What was interesting about it is in 1858, the school was originally designed as a house, and to my way of thinking, that doesn't look like, I'm going to flash back. Whoops. That doesn't look like a house that I would want to live in. Looks pretty austere. But it does give the complete history of the school, the funding for the school, and how much land was granted with the school for any outdoor recreation or activities. If you don't know what school your ancestors went to, if you live in a larger community, it does not have to be a large city, but city directories will give you a listing of the schools that are in the local area. Usually at the front of the city directory, you have the alphabetical listing of all of the citizens in the community. But in the back, sorted by topic, will be a listing of the schools. If your people lived in a rural area, you might want to consult a county history to see where the schools were located. And older maps are also a wonderful resource for locating cemeteries, schools, and other public buildings. Here's an example from Rochester, New York, which is a large city, but we see that we have scales and trucks, scalp specialists, school supplies, and we do finally have a listing of schools. There are alphabetical listings in the back of city directories. They'll have nurses and doctors and other. For the public schools, it's telling you to see an index of contents. But you'll notice that it lists all sorts of schools, whether they are public schools or private schools run by churches. Here is a correspondence school, run by the American Poultry Institute. There's a Hebrew school. There's a music school, a private kindergarten, a school that, oops, where's my cursor? A school that taught shorthand, or perhaps a private school for young ladies. So there are listings of the various types of schools, not necessarily just the public schools in the community. County history. Here's Rutherford County, and it's talking about the Bradley Academy, which was opened in Murfreesboro. It existed on paper, but in 1811, it opened its doors. So we're talking very early in the history of this community that there is a school and it is documented. So perhaps if your people lived in this area in this time frame, they might have attended the Bradley Academy. And it tells us who the first headmaster was for this school and gives a brief biography for him. What are the types of student records that you can go looking for? And what is contained in those records? Usually there is the personal information, the person's name, who their parent or guardian is, and it will usually give an age, not necessarily a birth date. They will talk about the courses that the person took, and the transcript will actually give the grades that the person took, achieved for each one of the classes. There might be immunization and health records contained in these, disciplinary files if need be. And if it was a private school or a school of higher education, there might also be financial records. Unfortunately, online, the only ones I could find for examples for these are from very, very recent. This happens to be from 2020, but we see that our student, he's got a student ID number, and we've got a transcript with the classes that he's taking, who the teachers were, the number of credits that he achieved. He's in the ninth grade, and what his grades were for each of the classes. There are also transfer transcripts. If one is transferring from a community college to a university, what are the classes that some of the classes that he is attempting to transfer, the grades and the credits that he received for them, and is the school accepting those credits for them? And you'll note in this particular case, he got an A, but they did not accept the credits in that transfer. I have no idea why, but they didn't. Immunization records. Many of us had shot records back in the day, and they still occur, so you might be able to find some information there. Disciplinary files. Here again, this was on the internet, which surprises me because it's 2020 and it has a student's name on it. And he is being disciplined for burglary, and he is going to be suspended for 5 days and will be allowed to return. So he hasn't been dismissed. So at least not yet. I was surprised to find out that the record retention for the permanent record was quite as long as it is. That doesn't mean that it still exists, but the permanent record, which does contain that basic information, the transcripts and the attendance records, they may be kept for as much as 100 years. There are temporary records that are only kept for about 5 years that might give some background information about the family, extracurricular activities, teachers' notes, discipline and health information. So those truly are just temporary. The resources, school records, school censuses. These are county level records, and they list the children, their ages, and the parents and guardians. Here's one from 1890. This is a pivotal time. The 1890 census burned. So we're to have this huge gap between 1880 and 1900. In this particular case, it just lists the parent or the guardian, the number of male and female children. And this you could match up with either the 1880 or the 1900 census to determine who those children are. If the numbers don't agree, perhaps there was a child that was born and died in that intervening period that you might not have been aware about. That one-room schoolhouse from Red Rock, Oklahoma, here is one of the school censuses, and we'll notice that Jess Driesel is the parent or guardian, and we see 4 children named Barnes, who are living in the household. So he's the guardian for these children, which asks the question, what is the relationship between them? This actually gives actual birth dates, not just the ages of the children. We have attendance rosters. Here again, we've got the parent or guardian and the child and their age, 4 years and 10 months, when they started school and when they left school for this particular term. And you'll notice that there are no ditto marks and no names in here for the children named Hall. So the question is Mr. Trowbridge the guardian for these children? Further information that is needed to be gathered. Here's one of those punishment books. So the names are listed, the various infractions, and how many strokes of, I don't know whether it's a ruler, a whip, but they're going to be punished. What you can find in these records, the children that might have been born and died between those two pivotal census years, the ages, and a simple age might infer the date of birth, but these are our birth certificates didn't come into being until the 1920s, or at least required until the 1920s. So you might find a birth record or a birth date that you didn't know. They can serve as a partial substitute for that census, and they do put your people in a time and place between those census years. There are annual reports put out by the superintendents, created by them for the Board of Education, and they may list various achievements, various people, the honors, and they may include pure statistics for the district. And you'll see that some of these are published and are available online. There are town meeting minutes that talk about the list of the teachers, who the people were that in the community that were in charge of the schools, and may list financial appropriations for improvements. And they may also talk about who the money was paid to. School board minute books also exist. These are county administrative records and might be available through the county or the school district. And they talk about and are focused primarily on the running of the school, the hiring, and the construction. So if your ancestor provided wood for the fires in the one-room schoolhouse, drove the school bus, or might have fixed something, the plumbing or the roof, the financial appropriation might be listed in the school board minute books. Here is just a simple printout from a school board meeting. It unfortunately is a current one, but it does have an entire paragraph on recognition for students who have participated in a particular club activity, that they have earned a certain amount of money and what it went for, and it lists each one of the students by name. It also talks about who is on the school board and what their roles were. So did your ancestor appear in one of these reports? Quickly, we've talked, most of these records are difficult to find. Many may not have survived. Very few are online. You might have to contact a local historical society. If the school still exists, visit the school and ask what records they still have and where their records might have been placed for safekeeping. The superintendent's office likely will also have some of these records. If they're very old, they might have been passed to a state library, a state archives, or in the county courthouse. And a local librarian might be available to point you in the right direction. Ancestry and Family Search disappointingly just have yearbooks, yearbook photos. They do have a very small number of school censuses, and they do have international records for, in particular, England. Archive.org, which is the Internet Archives, does have out-of-print books, and you might find some information there. I was able to find a superintendent's annual report that lists the teachers. So was one of your relatives a teacher? And could they appear in one of those reports? And then there's also, this is from 1918, there's the graduation exercises. And each one of the students, 6 of the 8 students are participating in giving something about the school, and they are receiving their diplomas. Excuse me. And with that, with 35 seconds to spare, we have come to our question time. So I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan to monitor any questions in the chat.
Well, Terry, we don't have any questions today, but I thought that this brought back, at least for me, a lot of memories of my school days. And recently came across, someone shared I think a 5th grade photo of the class, the teacher and the principal, but there were no names underneath the photos. And I think it's a responsibility of those of us that remember these names of our classmates, maybe to help identify each of the students that's in this picture. And so it's not lost in the future. So many times on Facebook, people will share school memories or photos or things like that. And while we still have that in our memories, it's a great thing to be able to share back and identify those in the photos. So.
Yes, if you have information that you know or that would be valuable to share with others, yes, by all means, find the local repository for some of this information and share as much information as you know. You never know who might be looking for it. I also want to add that the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center does have school censuses for Fremont County. They do have yearbooks, and they do have a collection of class photos. So if you happen to be from the local area, the museum does have a lot of information. I also need to point out that in their subject files, I believe they have 5 drawers of information about Canyon City schools that have existed from the mid-1800s up to the present day. So, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you for joining us this morning, and we'll advertise that Christmas is coming and hopefully give you some ideas and easy ways to share some of your genealogy research with your family, rather than letting it sit in a folder or in a file cabinet. So until October 9th, thank you very much for joining us again this morning, and we'll see you then.